Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me Will Wiseman. Will is currently the CEO and co-founder of Climatize, an easy and transparent mobile app enabling investments in renewable energy projects. Will has worked in the clean energy industry for 9 years in roles such as managing multi-million-dollar electrical projects, as an energy market analyst, and even as a solar panel installer. He holds a double master's in renewable energy engineering, which I didn't even know existed as a master's. and in 2023, Will was selected among the Forbes 30 Under 30 for social impact. In 2022, he was selected as Young Global Changer by the World Policy Forum. So I'm looking forward to talking about all things clean energy and finding out just how screwed up the planet really is. So Will Wiseman, welcome to the show.
Hey, Michael. Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I want to start on how you decided to get into clean tech so early, that you were majoring in renewable energy engineering at uni. I didn't even really know that was something someone could get. So I was wondering if maybe you were inspired when you were younger, or how you got put on that path.
Yeah, so I have a somewhat unique childhood experience in that my father is a marine biologist. And so over the course of my lifetime, I grew up with a very intimate relationship with the ocean. And so over my youth, I saw the kind of rapid collapse of the reef ecosystems. And that had a very impactful just journey in my youth. And so seeing the rapid degradation of those environments made me very aware of climate change from a very young age. And so I happened to get an internship at the particle physics lab at UCSC in high school. And so through that, I began to kind of understand energy and solar energy in particular. And so as I looked to then find my way into my career into college, I decided that that was really a path that I wanted to pursue. And so my first job actually then helping pay my way through college was as a solar installer. And I learned the industry from the ground up, really the nuts and bolts, or rather from the roof up, and was the guy actually putting panels on roofs and wiring them up. And so that helped me build fluency in the space. And then as I got my mechanical engineering degree and ultimately worked in AI for renewable energy power forecasting and in that large scale project management role, really saw the industry from all the different angles. And it was then that I realized that as an engineer, it was going to take 3 to 4 years per project that I wanted to be involved with. And that wasn't necessarily the impact I wanted to have over my career, maybe 15, 20 projects. And so I decided to go back and get those 2 graduate degrees, a master's in energy engineering and a master's in sustainable energy technologies, 1 degree from the Polytechnic University in Barcelona, and the second from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And so kind of collectively, those 2 degrees are renewable energy engineering. And so it is a very necessary skill set for a rapidly changing world. And so as I look to then specialize in those technologies and really intimately know everything from wind, solar, hydropower, hydrogen, battery storage, the whole gambit, began to recognize that it would be A, very difficult to be a master in all of them, but B, if I wanted to still maintain that flexibility across industries, that there may be a way in which, finance might actually be a way to still retain that technical fluency, but engage with many different kind of verticals within clean tech. And so that helped, I would say, inspire my journey into what is now Climatize.
That's really interesting. Even how you started as a solar installer, because I would imagine in California there's more opportunity for that than there would be in potentially other states. And so I hope that as solar or all these renewables start to proliferate around the U.S., they'll have people like you that can get into the industry and then all of a sudden start learning all the other ways. Are you finding that that's happening in the U.S., or is it still, a big focus on climate in California and not so much elsewhere?
Yeah, so I would say that there's a rapid kind of mainstream shift as to the concern of climate, and it's becoming more normalized. I mean, even if, 2, 3 years ago, you had told me that, hey, there was going to be electric vehicle commercials in the Super Bowl, I would have thought you were crazy. And now almost every car commercial in, a major media event like that is an electric vehicle. And I think that that is a kind of proxy for how the zeitgeist and the mainstream is shifting. Now, to your point about kind of work education around, labor for the energy transition, that is one of the bottlenecks of, kind of current ability to deploy projects rapidly. So when we look at kind of the four bottlenecks, you can say capital first and foremost. Projects can only be deployed as fast as there's money to actually build them. And then it comes to supply chain, so availability of panels, inverters, etc., the various pieces of those solar projects. Labor, for sure, is a big one in terms of people having that appropriate skill set and ability, not only in the country as a whole, but then geographically specifically. And then finally, permitting and the ability to actually get these projects plugged into the grid, whether that's the interconnection from the utility or permitting from the various boards that you need approval from for construction of projects.
Right, that's really interesting. And it's probably great for you as well to have the experience in Barcelona and in Sweden and in Stockholm, to seeing how different countries are tackling such things and even getting just new ideas pushed in. Are you finding any fundamental cultural differences in how people are speaking about climate change in the future, be it, Spain, Scandinavia, or where you are in the US?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll take 2 points on this. So, for one, the sustainability conversation in the United States, there is no way to separate that from the previous incumbent energy majors. The United States, after the fracking boom, is the world's largest exporter of both natural gas and petroleum. And most people don't realize that. They still think of the Middle East as the leader in petroleum. However, the fracking and essentially the ability to extract more petrochemicals using that technology has really pushed the US to the forefront of fossil fuel production. And so it's very hard to talk about the energy transition without talking about, fossil fuels hand in hand. And those incumbent powers are less entrenched in the EU. You still have Ørsted, for example, up in Norway, and there's Repsol in Spain that definitely have major powers, but you don't have this, say, concentration of fossil fuel resources that enables those companies to really drive policy quite as strongly as it happens in the US. And so that is, I would say, a fundamental difference between the two markets. And then additionally, what we're doing with Climatize in terms of renewable energy crowdfunding is actually a business model that is rapidly developing and more mature in the EU than it is in the US. So, and that is primarily driven because of a key regulatory change that actually just shifted in 2021. So in the EU, previously, you were able to crowdfund up to 5 million euros for any given project. And up until 2021, you could only crowdfund $1 million. And that kind of difference between 5 million and 1 million is a really big step in terms of the project scale that you can build in renewable energy projects. And so that is fundamentally why the US has been slow to adopt this business model while it's really blossomed in the EU. Some of the leading platforms in the EU, for example, the leading platform in the Netherlands has 275 million euros of assets under management, and they've done 227 projects. They've only had 3 failures, and they've returned 70 million euros back to their investors so far.
What's that platform called?
Duurzame Investeren. And I know I just butchered the pronunciation of that because I don't speak Dutch. But
yeah, no, I'll Google it.
So that platform has done incredibly well in a much, much smaller market than any of the platforms in the US in terms of traction. And yet the US is a much larger market. Now, when the US and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, increased the ceiling from $1 million up to $5 million, that was actually when we pivoted the business from the EU to the US to take the best practices from the EU and transplant them as a first mover into the US. And so
Okay.
those cultural differences that I observed while doing my master's degrees in Europe have then benefited me as we look to transplant them and see if this kind of business model takes off in the US. And so far, we're seeing promising early results.
That's amazing. I really like cross country or even cross continent collaboration because you find like such minor things as regulatory things, like you mentioned, but also culturally, it's amazing how a little bit of perspective can change, a business model or a business itself. Um, I was hoping maybe you can give us an idea for what the difference in projects are between 1 million and 5 million that can be started and what their impact are.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say with $1 million, you're talking about very small. I'm going to use solar as a kind of a particular example. Small commercial industrial projects. And you can't necessarily begin to get the economies of scale that are very important for the project economics there. But additionally, there's only a small subset of projects that are actually that small. That is, I would call it generally 500 kilowatts and below. And there is a subsection of the market that is that scale. However, if you're able to go up to $5 million, then you're talking maybe 2.5 megawatts, and you can begin to actually get into these projects that are brownfield projects or greenfield projects that actually then can power, hundreds of homes, if not 1,000 homes, versus, these small projects that may power one business. And so being able to get to that kind of larger sector of the projects is really where we've found this underserved niche of projects that were not being capitalized by commercial lenders, the banks, because of the time and transaction cost necessary for that. And so by bringing in a more flexible financing structure in which these project developers can raise this capital from the community and the underlying networks in that community, we're able to help bring in financing from the local region and enable that community to be an active stakeholder in its energy resources and in the energy transition.
Wow. So I read through some of the documents that you had sent on how Climatize works, and it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your hypothesis is one of the biggest barriers to us succeeding this energy transition or accelerating the process of it is capital allocation, essentially. And if we're able to allocate more capital to these projects, then we will be able to keep ourselves below 2 degrees or 1.5 degree rise. Like, am I characterizing that correctly?
Yes, definitely. And so
Okay.
the problem now is climate change is really a capital allocation problem in the sense that we have the technologies that are necessary to avert climate change. There are some sectors like aviation that we don't have the technology, and that will come, but that will be at the end of the transition. If we talk about low-hanging fruit in which we can actually start taking really meaningful bites out of the global carbon budget, the first step is decarbonizing the electricity system. Because what that does is it allows you to then go and decarbonize transportation as well as much of manufacturing and industry. And then you can look at how do we heat our homes, which is another really large sector of total emissions. And each one of those buckets can be decarbonized through clean electricity. And there are other major verticals like agriculture, for example, and the embedded carbon that goes into the food that you eat. And then, very hard industrials such as steel, cement, and aviation in particular are going to be the last to transfer. But the
Right.
first low hanging fruit that we can get is by decarbonizing the electricity system. And that comes through renewable energy, primarily solar, wind, and storage. Also, nuclear is a very important energy resource within that mix, just given the fact that it's very sustainable or very stable baseload power that is maybe not doesn't have the same characteristics of wind and solar, which are variable based on when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. As we have, greater deployment of storage assets as well, that will provide a very meaningful balance to wind and solar so that you have them, when it's dark out or when it's not blowing wind. And so those basic technologies we have today, it's an aspect of like how fast are we going to allocate capital to deploying those projects so that we can begin to really take that low hanging fruit out of the equation.
Right, because that's really interesting, because I can imagine in real time you're seeing kind of the evolution of the technologies that are out there also improving while you're getting this, more capital out, more people that are able to use apps like Climatize to send any sort of money to these projects, because you have things like nuclear fusion that is always 10 years away, but seems to have some real movement recently. But even I've been watching things on YouTube or even in the news where there's just new battery technologies that it seems like everybody at every university in some respect is working on a new battery so we can have better storage capacity in the future. And so I'm curious how you arrived at your hypothesis that the answer is just more capital. Because obviously I would say I personally really like the idea, because I'm not a defeatist where some people say like, oh, we shouldn't use less water or use paper straws because the corporations are always going to pollute. I personally think that like every little bit helps, and we can also work on the larger issues out there. So I was wondering how you came up with this hypothesis that this capital would really help accelerate things, and like why you and your co-founder decide to invest so much time and energy into this project.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, as with anything, so you bring up a really good point in kind of innovation of potential future gains of technology improvements versus deploying capital now and deploying it into projects now. So I think it's a yes and. It's not a this or this. We see major efficiency gains as the amount of any technology is doubled in total volume. We call that the learning curve. So like, what is your efficiency gain every time you double production value? And if you look at 2010 to 2019, the cost of solar came down by 95%. And that is something that a lot of people don't necessarily recognize, that the stereotypes of that technology are no longer relevant. Solar power is the cheapest source of energy in the world currently. We're seeing power purchase agreements signed for 2 cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, that is mind-boggling. Wow. And that is where...
Is it, sorry to interrupt, is it right that the theoretical limit of solar energy has also increased? Because I remember it was like 30%, but I thought I had read somewhere that the theoretical limit had also increased along with efficiency.
So, I mean, there are increasing ways through technology, pardon me, that they're able to extract more energy from a given panel. So, for example, by doing bifacial panels, having cells both on the top and the bottom, improving the junctions, improving the wiring. There are ways to, squeeze out more watts per panel. The theoretical kind of band gap of how much energy. So when you have solar and it hits these doped panels with its phosphorus and boron, there's a certain kind of range in which you're able to displace an electron. And without getting like way into the weeds of the details on the science there, like that side is relatively capped. There are ways that you can experiment with other than chemical compounds in those in the panel chemical makeup. However, that side of it is relatively static so far. We have still continued to see efficiency gains in ultimately panel manufacturing volume, in the way that the panels, not only the aluminum siding, making them more lightweight for transportation, getting them from point A to point B, but also smaller framing so that you have more of that exposed solar cell that is then not being covered by the aluminum framing. So little things like that do actually make efficiency gains at scale.
Right. That's great because I really love hearing more because solar is the one that everyone seems to understand right now. Like I don't see any wind projects in the city, obviously. So I think most people want to think, okay, how can I bring my energy bills down? I know in Spain right now, well, at least in the winter, energy and gas was through the roof. So people are really thinking like, okay, well, how can I make my house more efficient to make my budget and my spending more efficient? And so where do you think or where do you see a lot of these projects being allocated that are helping everyday people see that this energy transition will be good for them, or are they mostly more industrial size?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say one of the really rapidly developing kind of sub verticals of solar in the US that we're seeing benefit everyday people the most is one called community solar. And this is kind of halfway between the residential system and the big utility system that would be, out in the desert. And the big difference here is that if you're doing residential solar, you have to own your roof. And that is not accessible to everybody financially. And additionally, then, even if you do own your own roof, you have to have all of the money to go and put that project on your roof. And so that does create barriers to entry for many people. And then on the other side, you have the mega project out in the desert that's funded by the utility and generally has a couple very large power purchase agreements, or, it's just 100% of that power is being bought by the utility. With community solar, what happens is that you can subscribe to a project that's kind of medium in scale, and then the credits can be they can be reconciled to your bill digitally. And what this means is now you can appreciate the energy savings of solar. Generally seeing 10 to 15% savings immediately. And through that, now these oftentimes low to middle income families are able to access that clean, cheaper power without needing to have it on their roof. And those are the projects, community solar, that we have really zeroed in on funding because they're able to appreciate the economies of scale of a larger project while being more strategically located in communities, sometimes on parking garages. For example, this first project we have on the platform is on kind of a commercial industrial building. Additionally, we've seen community solar arrays sited on houses of worship that can serve as a revenue stream to help sustain, that building. Additionally, like a boys and girls club, somewhere that's a community center, or on a theater. And so because these projects are strategically located in a way where, you have sufficient roof space to make them more financially viable, while at the same time enabling multiple people to buy from that project versus Amazon, Meta, Google, for example, being the full off-taker of that project, it enables those projects to then really have more community impact. And so with those projects, that's where we're seeing a lot of kind of community benefit from a local jobs perspective, from that cheaper energy actually making it to the end consumer, and then being able to have technical benefits when siting on the grid, because then oftentimes you don't have to do the same grid upgrades that you would do with a utility scale project.
Right. I can imagine you're seeing or feeling a lot more benefit from running something like this opposed to if you're working on an engineering project, or maybe you're working on the ITER project, or you're trying to create a fusion reactor where it might take you 10 years or 5 years, where like you can see the fruits of your labor work more often. You can update all of these different projects. Are you finding that, or you still feel like you kind of have it in your blood that you want to go build something, like, and I mean physical?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a rush every day. And the fact that we get to work with all of these project developers at a very intimate level and still feel like we're in the trenches with them, I think that is, A, it's a joy to me, but B, it keeps us with that sense that we're actually in the field doing the hard work. Because part of our competitive advantage is that we're coming from the engineer's side. And so we really understand what it means to build high quality projects and really what it takes to de-risk those assets. And so when a developer comes to us, we, instead of having this kind of, going to the bank feel, it's instead, hey, we're previous developers. We understand the challenges that you're experiencing. Let's sit down and understand, how do we mitigate these risks? How can we vet your project and ultimately seek to help you raise the capital that you need to help further your ability to build new clean energy projects? And so the way that we approach these project developers and the way that they are working with us feels still like we're kind of engineers working with engineers, even though our role now is vetting and diligencing these projects before enabling them to go raise on the platform. So it is like putting two like minds together versus potentially a more adversarial negotiation in which, somebody is, really trying to get the upper hand. We see this as kind of a win-win in which, when high quality project developers look to raise capital from their communities, and those projects are, have the appropriate risk profile for those investors, then matching those two together is net positive versus a kind of winner take all feeling that can oftentimes be the kind of tradition in finance.
Right. I wonder, it's really great that it sounds like you said your partner, your co-founder, is also an engineer. Because are you finding, because anytime there's a big swing in fund allocation, there will all be some people that want to do a project that is kind of a boondoggle. Have you found any people that have come to you that said like, hey, I want you to fund this project, but then when you and your co-founder did due diligence, you found that like, no, this is this is not a good idea. This is a waste of a lot of people's time.
Yeah, definitely. And we generally see that at the first meeting. That's something that we take that screening call and we can get a sense of, is this going to have, sufficiently dependable cash flows for them to be able to borrow? Because ultimately what project developers are doing on our platform is they're coming and they're issuing promissory notes, which is debt financing. And so they are essentially borrowing against the cash flows of their existing projects or soon to be operating projects to be able to go and deploy that into building new projects. So the way it works is the investor is actually invested directly in a solar project, in the cash flows of that solar project. And the developer is pulling that money out so that they can do A, some of the operation of that project, but B, go and develop new projects. And so your money is directly invested in the solar project, and it frees up cash flows for the developer to go build new projects. Now, if a project developer comes to us and say, hey, we have this first of a kind technology where we're not necessarily sure how it's going to pan out, we're not going to feel that that has the appropriate risk profile for, in particular, retail investors that are putting some of this weight on us to do some of this screening on their behalf. Because we understand through customer interviews that, when people see these projects on our platform, they expect that we have done appropriate due diligence and that we are mitigating some of that risk for them. Everybody has to do their homework. Everyone has to determine if a project meets their risk profile. And so, this is no way, shape, or form investment advice, nor is it, a essentially us taking on that full research for any investor. However, we understand that that is the expectation that people come to our platform with. And so we have to hold ourselves to that standard just as our everyday operations. And so when we see projects, may have risks that we don't necessarily want to expose people on our platform to, it's not going to be a fit.
Okay, so the way, if I'm understanding correctly, you guys are kind of filling the need where it's not startup investing where you're taking a larger risk and when being unsure if this sort of solar, wind, etc. project could not get off the ground. You're actually vetting these companies who potentially can't get money from banks because they're a solar project, and maybe people at the bank don't really understand where their cash flows are going to come from, or the whole industry in general, where you guys do understand the economics behind these certain projects, and so you will deem them safer than a bank would. Is that accurate?
I wouldn't necessarily say safer. It's that you had a point in that the banks don't necessarily always have the ability to do the technical due diligence on this project. And so many of them are then not underwriting it because they don't have that foundation. It's oftentimes that the banks when they try and get an army of consultants and an army of lawyers around a table, the transaction cost to them doesn't fit within the margins of these smaller projects. And so they're just not spending the time to actually vet and do the diligence on these projects. We are starting with this niche of underfunded projects because we recognize that there is a very large economic opportunity there if you're willing to do the work. And so we are coming in and doing that work and making it available to our clients. And so we do have a very thorough due diligence process that was in part crafted with the Department of Energy and with their National Community Solar Partnership. So, we had oversight, and that process was vetted and approved through that partnership there. I would say, with these projects, if you understand the risk profile of a project, for example, it's been already constructed, it's mechanically complete, and it is simply waiting for the utility to provide a stamp for it to be energized, and that project developer wants to borrow against those future cash flows, which are going to be available in a month or two. And you have certainty that, hey, this stamp is not actually the risk of the project. All of that has been de-risked, and now we're able to offer this investment that has an elevated return profile because of just that final last thing. Then we have confidence that, hey, that's going to get done for sure. That person is going to come out, they're going to look over this project, they're going to stamp it off. And that is attractive to somebody who wants exposure to this asset class for a competitive return profile.
Right. That's fascinating. Yeah, and on that note, I was hoping you could walk us through exactly how Climatize works. Like, where can people find it first of all, and then, like, when you're onboarding them, how does Climatize work for actually getting money from people and then allocating from there?
Sure, yeah. So you can find Climatize in the iOS App Store. It's available for iPhone at the moment, and then we're going to be building in Android in the future here. From there, you can download the app, and you can view the projects without even needing to create an account, and you can see what opportunities are available on the platform. If you find one that, kind of meets your interests, you can go and set up account. We then take in your personal information. That is really for anti-money laundering, know your customers. So we keep a very high bar to make sure that the platform is safe for everybody, not only from a cybersecurity perspective and the various tests that we've done to ensure that our information and your information is safe with us, but additionally that any capital flowing through our marketplace is, it's being checked because we are ultimately a regulated entity as well. So from there, we take in that information and you're able to connect with your bank account. From there, you can make an ACH or a wire transfer. It just goes to an escrow account. And as the funding for this project is raised, the money goes into the escrow account. Once the target of the raise is hit, then the project developer is able to withdraw those funds. And depending upon the structure of the financial product, you can be repaid on either a monthly, a quarterly, or an annual basis. And that funding, they just pay back into the escrow account, and the escrow account is dispersed back to all of the investors, right back to your bank account. And so it just comes right full circle back to your account.
Okay, that is pretty straightforward. And if you guys, I don't know how long you guys have been in business for, because I was going to ask, do you have a relative default rate yet on people not paying, or how the projects are going so far?
Yeah, so we are in the first project raise at the moment. It took us a full year to get through the regulatory process. And then that first project raised over $100,000 in the first week. And so that was a really exciting milestone for us to pass and early traction. And now as we get these projects up and operating, and we will start to see kind of how that default rate of the vintages of projects turn out in time. However, unfortunately, I can't speak to that yet.
Right. Okay. Well, that's great though that you had 100,000 in a week, because I would imagine this thing just needs time to kind of proliferate and get out there, that people understand that they can, just download an app and start allocating funds. Is it? Are you trying to also court businesses to start allocating some of their funds? Like how far are you guys from getting any sort of? Could you get any institutional capital on this, or is this mainly like a direct-to-consumer sort of venture?
Yeah, so I'm not at liberty to name names. However, we're working on some distribution partnerships with very large broker dealers that would enable us to essentially have these investment opportunities surfaced on other platforms as well. So that can help ultimately, spread our reach. We're working on partnerships with green debit card providers in a way in which Climatize could be a reward for your card spending. We're also working with one company that potentially can be an HR incentive, so working essentially with employee engagement on that front. And then additionally, yes, so our issuances, part of the innovation of actually using the crowdfunding framework is that we can service everyone from, mom and pop retail investors all the way through institutional investors. If you have that accredited or qualified investor status, the amount you can invest is unlimited on any given project. And so with that, we have at least one community bank that we have been in conversations with about potentially collaborating on deal flow with, and they would be interested in sourcing projects from our pipeline, and they're waiting to see how these kind of projects turn out. And so from there, we will look to spin up a larger debt fund in the future that can help facilitate investments into larger projects, and we'll work more closely with those institutional players. However, that just requires, first and foremost, these pilot projects and these success case studies to show, to your point, what are the default rates, what are the risks, how do these actually perform out in the wild, and once those kind of metrics and volatility has settled, they will be more comfortable in engaging with a platform like ours as a way to source deal flow in their, geographic regions.
Right, and because so I can imagine then that a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines right now, seeing if you can prove out your model, and then people are more willing to jump in, especially if they're trying to, and they need to do the due diligence for the funds of their employees, or they're going to be putting it into, like you said, like a credit card situation, or an HR reward. Because if it's in an HR reward, would someone be given, okay, you get 100 reward bucks that are going into Climatize, and then you get also the return that comes from it? Like, is that kind of how it would work?
Yeah, so that's what we're kind of trying to figure out, how to ultimately structure a partnership like that in a way that aligns with the regulatory framework, in a way that we're, staying within our boundaries, staying within what's possible there. And yet at the same time that, your employer might match what you invest into Climatize. Instead of, say, buying carbon credits, you could potentially make these investments into projects, and your employer would help support that as well. And we've seen that, there's a growing desire to have a differentiated channel between, carbon credits on one side and ESG investing on the other, in which that's more of a risk metric and kind of a catch-all. We see this as one of the most transparent ways to actually invest in renewable energy, and really specifically renewable energy projects, so that you have a line of sight to the project that you're investing in, versus putting your money in a bucket of corporate equity and hoping that actually then trickles all the way down to projects on the ground.
Right. And I guess touching on corporate equity for a minute, because you seem to have such a easy fluidity with all the moving parts in this space. Honestly, it's amazing. Like, you can tell how much time and work you put into studying this industry, and how it all comes together. So how would you foresee the future for us to get larger, polluting corporations to step up and start helping with this energy transition? Because sometimes it's against their financial incentives, unfortunately. So whereas you seem to be working with the tide of capitalism, we kind of don't want to wait until it becomes only the profit motive that gets these corporations to step up and start decarbonizing, or worse, for whatever other pollutants they're putting out there. So I'd love to hear what you think about that equation, outside of the Climatize.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple points here. So I know it's a bit cliche, but people vote with their wallets. And so ultimately, where people are spending their money and the brands that they go to support very much impacts the decisions that those brands take. And so I would say, fast fashion is one sector that is very destructive in terms of,
The worst.
corporate waste, and turnover of products that are, just being landfilled versus actually used. And so the brands that you support in that sector, and the supply chains that they use to source, their materials and whatnot do have a very large impact on the big picture. And then one step back as well, we are in a new phase of the energy transition in which previously it was what I called green red. Green red was when people were taking these green decisions based on, morals and values, even if it didn't necessarily pencil out to be the best business decision. They saw brand value and ultimately corporate responsibility outweighing the potential bottom line cost there. Now we're in a phase of green black, where solar is the cheapest energy resource in the world, depending upon where you're sourcing it. And so now we are in this phase where it is just bad business if you are not taking some of these sustainability practices, because you're also mitigating long-term risk in terms of energy hedges. To your point, in Spain, energy costs went through the roof. If you have solar, then you have a sense of what that energy cost increase over the next 20, 25 years is going to be. And you are no longer as dependent or exposed to that energy price risk that you would have been, were you still buying, say, natural gas. And you see that disruption by Russia in the availability of gas in both Germany and throughout Europe, and those prices skyrocketing. I mean, if you have solar, that is one way to hedge against that electricity price volatility. And so now, as we're in this green-black phase, I think a lot of businesses are going to begin to make that transition. And that is in part enabled by government policy. So for one, the Inflation Reduction Act and much of the incentives in that federal financing package have then led to the build out of new battery manufacturing facilities in the US. And that's because of the underlying financial incentives that make it a clear choice to site and develop those manufacturing facilities in the United States. I had a chance to meet Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm in January, and in her speech, she talked about how the US has 39 new battery manufacturing facilities in development after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, because those incentives are so juicy to those manufacturers. And so, that's kind of the carrots. And if we talk about sticks in terms of taxes and ways to kind of, penalize those movers, those have been politically less tenable. They are less durable as well on the macro level. And so, things like carbon taxes haven't been as successful at the policy level, while the incentives instead have and seem to have real sticking power and the ability to move markets. So, first of all, at the personal level, it does come down to the decisions and the things that you choose. And even though it's cliche, it does make an impact, because those companies are ultimately responsible to their bottom line, and where you spend your money does make a big difference. And then as we look at federal policy laying the groundwork, it is now the foundation to enable this energy transition, because, the work that we're doing today and, building this new manufacturing capacity is going to pay dividends in 5 years, when all of a sudden we're able to manufacture twice as many batteries, and, those supply chains are more developed, and the production is closer to ultimately the final endpoint of usage. So all of this is a virtuous flywheel in which every little decision and impact does really play into the larger momentum of this transition.
I love hearing about that. And I wish, especially you said like subsidies and how the Inflation Reduction Act made building those battery plants so much more attractive. It would be nice if they started reducing incentives for, let's say, maybe dairy or beef or oil producers and all these things that are still getting subsidies, that are making billions and billions of profit, that they don't need the supplement or the subsidies that they get. I guess that's a much bigger issue. That's something where like Congress, that doesn't work great on a good day, has to go ahead and tackle. But I want to be respectful of your time. So before we sign off, I'd love to hear what your big dream vision is for Climatize in the next 5 or 10 years. Like, if you could dream of how much good you can do and everything would work really well, I'd love to hear what that looks like.
Sure, yeah. So our 5 year goal is to enable over $1 billion a year to be invested into new renewable energy projects. We are focused on North America at the moment because of the regulatory framework of crowdfunding and the oversight of the regulators there. However, we have ambitions to be a global platform to enable this not only in Europe, but India, Latin America, and Africa as well. And as the policy framework evolves in Southeast Asia and Asia to really target there as well. We see Climatize as the potential to really enable the everyday person to be an active stakeholder in the energy transition, not just a neutral bystander. We, as everyday people, need a more effective tool than simply making cardboard signs and going and doing protests. And, the amount of impact that we can create through our spending is important, but is not all encompassing. And so, to the degree in which Climatize enables these people and everyone to really invest in renewable energy assets that decarbonize the electricity grid and lays that foundation for a more broad economic decarbonization, is really where we see ourselves creating the most leverage in this picture. So, $1 billion a year in 5 years is the goal.
That's amazing. Yeah, because I was interested in this. Well, that's the reason I reached out to you. But after hearing how it all comes together in detail, like the next thing I do is download this app after this interview, because I really want to follow you guys, and I hope you hit that goal and surpass it.
Well, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share this story, and thanks for being such a great host.
Yeah, and thanks for coming. I really appreciate your time. All the best.
Same to you.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.